Thank you very much. This is a great moment. There's a great deal in common between our mission for the United Nations University, dealing with ethics, governance and law, the mission of ALCO and the mission of Jindal Global University. And I can't think of a better place and a better occasion on which to sign that MOU. I come to you with two sources of humility that you might not expect from a Western lawyer. The sources of this humility are twofold. The first is that I come from Queensland. Just on 2 decades ago, Queensland was, to say the least, the butt of jokes about ethics, governance and law in Australia. At that stage, the Chief of Police was corrupt and jailed. 4 ministers of the Crown were corrupt and jailed. And the Premier, who'd appointed all these guys, and actually had got rid of a clean Chief of Police in order to install his own personal favourite, well, actually he didn't go to jail, but that was because of a little scandal with the jury. The second basis of my humility is that as a lawyer, I know that law does not of itself provide the answer to corruption. It does not even provide, I think I will argue, the largest part of the answer. All it can do is provide a vital backstop to the answers that must be based on institutional reform and ethical regeneration. It is a critical role, but it is a support role for larger changes in the way in which institutions do their business. This limited role of law is not always obvious. In the first stages of a crisis caused by governmental or business wrongdoing, the initial public reaction is to seek out the culprits and punish them, and make sure that the laws are much tougher next time. However, those who think that increasing the penalties to catch the bad apples is or even can be the answer remind me of H.L. Mencken's great comment. To every complex problem, there is always a simple solution, and it's always wrong. In fact, actually, I think that contrary to H.L. Mencken, in fact, there are 3 simple solutions, all of which are wrong. Because, of course, most of these crises go through the cycles. The first is the legal one. Let's toughen up the laws. Then, of course, people realise that prosecutions take a long time and are frequently inconclusive. The money that was stolen often can't be recovered, and often the money that was stolen has been blown on tanks and planes and overseas holidays. So, second, of course, people say, well, laws whose purposes are not internalised are rarely effective, and then people start preaching ethics. But then often they start preaching bare ethics, as if sort of just preaching to people to be good would be sufficient in itself. And in fact, of course, things that, and as I've said, ethical standard setting in the absence of legal support, it just becomes a knave's charter. But thirdly, that legal and ethical reforms do not of themselves deal with some of the institutional questions of why bad apples get to such positions of power and attempted to abuse that power for their own ends. If in fact we find that there are a very large number of crooked politicians or CEOs or lawyers or other professionals, if we find that just about every apple in the barrel is rotten, it may be something about the barrel and not about the apples. And if we pull out all the rotten apples and put in a whole lot of new apples, funnily enough, they go rotten as well. And I think this is a conscious recognition that we need institutional reforms as well. And this is the third phase. But typically, these reforms are pursued individually. They don't realise that, in fact, that what you need is a combination of ethical standard setting, legal regulation and institutional reform, all of which are seeking to raise standards of government, in government and reduce corruption, rather than single alternatives. These single answers pressed by activists, though, unfortunately is reflected in the silos of academic disciplines. Lawyers, economists, political scientists and ethicists all have a lot to say about corruption. They've got many important insights of it into corruption and various other problems of institutions. The problem is that each has an over-theorised and simplistic view of institutions, their problems and the solutions. And as I am actually trained as 3 and self-trained as the 4th of those disciplines, I recognise their strengths and weaknesses. Lawyers, bless our hearts, when they look at an organisation, they look at rules, formal rules, contracts, constitutions. If there's a problem with the institution, it must be that they've been written wrongly. So the solution is to throw some more laws at the problem. Some people, liberals in America were accused of throwing money at problems. Lawyers throw laws at problems. And of course, law deans are always happy with this solution. But then political scientists also have their views. But for them, it's all about power. Who gets what and how. If there's a problem with the institution, it's a problem with the power structure, and the solution is to fix the power structure. Ethicists are a little bit like lawyers. It's all about norms, but it's about the informal norms, the culture, and if there's a problem with an institution, it's the way in which those norms have been articulated and the ways in which they're understood by the members. And of course, economists, bless their hearts, if they've got them. Officially, if you are a traditional neoliberal economist, you can't have a heart because, of course, that would be not what economic man has. That all human beings are or track the behaviour of those sociopaths, otherwise known as economic mans. But in fact, I will bless their hearts because they actually have them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to turn up to their lectures. When they look at institutions, they look at incentives and disincentives. And if there's a problem at an institution, it's because perverse incentives have been created, and the answer is to institutional problems is to ensure that the incentives and disincentives are aligned with the behaviours that you want and you don't want. Now, the interesting thing, despite my little comment about sociopaths, and I don't believe most economists are, they just say that everybody else is, that in fact each of them has a really, really, really important insight into the nature of institutions, their problems and the solutions. The only problem is they don't have the whole of that insight. If you try to engage in institutional reform and ignore the insights of any of ethicists, lawyers, economists or political scientists, you will fail. On the other hand, if you only rely on their insights, if you only rely on their theory, then in that case you will also fail. And so much of the tragedy of the last 20 years is that so many of the attempts to solve corruption in other countries has been to throw laws at them, often a law that is a favourite one in the consultant's own jurisdiction, but may have nothing to do and no use to do in the broad one. Sometimes there are some who throw institutions, often a favourite institution. An ICAC is a very popular one, but there are others as well. And then there are economic reform, which often is actually throwing laws at problems, taking the laws away. And again, the thing is that each of them have insights, but it's not as if operating on any one of them is going to be sufficient. In fact, it's going to lead to disappointment. And for people to say, well, law or ethics or economics or political reform has nothing to do with fixing corruption because each of them are tried singly and fail individually. So how do we actually bring together, if you like, these insights of the different disciplines and the passion of the various reformers? This is where we return, again with some modesty, to the anti-corruption effort in Queensland some 2 decades ago. In the late 1980s, there was one model that those engaged in fighting corruption tended to follow. It was the Hong Kong model. It was a strong ICAC and a strong anti-corruption law. And this was seen as the universal model. And it's interesting that there are three states, actually. 2 states were having huge problems with corruption in the late 1980s. One of them decided to adopt the Hong Kong model, the New South Wales government, which actually had apparently less serious problems than Queensland. Queensland did take a different approach. There was an iconic commission of inquiry led by a guy called Tony Fitzgerald, and whilst they were implementing the Hong Kong model attempting to in New South Wales, he said quite modestly that he didn't know the answers, but at least he thought he knew what the questions were, and quite a few questions there were. So he recommended, and Queensland did, adopt a process where they created an independent governance reform commission called the Electoral Administrative Reform Commission, which looked at a whole series of governance issues within the state in sequence and coherently. Not just should you have an ICAC, yes, they did have an ICAC called the Criminal Justice Commission, but also they wanted to look at issues of electoral reform, the Electoral Commission and its independence, how boundaries were drawn, look at administrative law, look at the Ombudsman, look at the parliamentary draftsman, look at parliamentary committees, look at public sector ethics. And a whole series of issues were studied by an independent commission, and they went through a really interesting process whereby they had an issues paper. They looked at what seemed to be the strengths in Queensland, the weaknesses in Queensland, what other countries did, and they would then have a public conference which everyone could go to, in which they brought experts and people like me who obviously weren't, and then there were public comments, and then there was a report. But of course, the reform wasn't done outside of Parliament. Parliament has to be the heart of Parliament. Congress has to be the heart of governance reform. It went back to a bipartisan committee. And the interesting thing, of course, the demand reform was so great that neither government nor opposition felt that they could block significantly the proposals that came through. Although some things they decided they didn't want a Bill of Rights. There were some interesting reasons for that which I won't go into. But believing that rights would be could be protected by a series of other measures. But this whole idea of actually not the Hong Kong model, not one institution, but several institutions, none of them as strong as an ICAC, each of them is a way slightly weaker, sometimes checking each other, but sometimes actually supporting each other. In fact, it was very interesting, and when we studied this, as to, is this just checks and balances? No, it's not, because each of them had a positive role to play. And I put it as a little bit like your fingers together, quite loosely. The thing is that when they're all operating as they should, their various institutions, they're collaborating. If one of them wants to do the wrong thing, they pull away. Firstly, it's actually hard to pull away, and everybody else notices. So it's actually something, it's not checks and balances, it's not just collaboration, it's actually a dynamic relationship which actually amounts to both. And so this was very interesting. I actually called it an ethics regime because of the importance of ethics in it, and that term was picked up by Lord Nolan when they were trying to deal with sleaze in England, picked up by the OECD under the name ethics infrastructure. But somebody else could also see this enormous significance of a different model for fighting corruption. There's Jeremy Pope, the Foundation's CEO of Transparency International. He came to Queensland and again he said, hey, this is different. It's not the Hong Kong model, it's better. He called it a national integrity system. And that is the name that's stuck as when the World Bank started to endorse it. And so actually it came to be seen as best practice. And so Queensland went actually in only 5 years from being the ethical laughingstock and basket case of the South Pacific into a global exemplar for a better way of doing things. And it was interesting in all of this when I asked Jeremy, why did you call it an integrity system? Why did you call it an anti-corruption system? TI is the Global Coalition Against Corruption. He said, well, that sounded a bit negative, just call it anti-corruption system. Now that actual intuitive response was actually leads to something really, really important about ethics and anti-corruption and good governance. In the sense that eliminating corruption cannot be the primary goal of governance reform. It is a necessary incidental to good governance reform, but it's not the only goal. And there's two reasons I'll give. Lots of reasons, two reasons I'll give. Firstly is the meaning of corruption. Many of you have heard the Transparency International definition of corruption. It's the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain, which, by the way, includes party political gain. Because much corruption in many countries is actually, especially in Japan and America, is conducted for party political goals rather than actual personal enrichment. Although there is a bit of that as well. But so that's the definition of corruption, the abuse of entrusted power. But actually, how do you know what an abuse of power is unless you know what the correct use of power is? And so actually I've seen integrity and corruption as opposite sides of the one coin. But actually you can't mince it without integrity. In fact, it really is corruption the opposite. Because unless you know what the correct use is, you can't know what abuse is. And the integrity is the use of entrusted power for purposes that are publicly justified and officially endorsed. And that's integrity. And of course corruption is the opposite side. And you've got to stop corruption. But actually the principal goal is not, as I say, just to stop corruption. And this is the second point I want to make. And that's the problem of the perfect solution. In the Seoul International Anti-Corruption Conference, I was asked to run a series of ethics workshops, 10 ethics workshops. And in introducing the whole thing, slyly, wryly, probably a bit of both, I said, there are 2,000 people in this conference. Everybody has got a means for reducing corruption. And some 90%, some 80%. And I think, look, if you decided to do everything I suggested, and I was right, two totally preposterous suggestions, totally right anyway, you might reduce corruption by 98%. But I have for you a much more comprehensive solution to government corruption. We can actually eliminate government corruption 100% permanently, instantaneously, overnight. Now, a few people raised their eyebrows and said, what is this? Abolish government. No government corruption. Now, of course, traditionally there are anarchists to the left and more recently to the right who think this is a wonderful idea, but most don't. Most people throw up their hands and say, why are you throwing up your hands? Well, the reason is that people actually want governments because they want to do something. In fact, people actually take a risk concentrating power, people and resources in governments and in fact in corporations and in professions and any other organisation. Concentrates power, people and resources in order to achieve a public good. But that very same concentration of power, people and resources can of course be abused and used for other purposes. But this is actually, if you like, the eternal thing that we must recognise in governance, is that we are taking a risk by creating institutions. That it needs to be a calculated risk, and it's a risk that we should minimise. And you minimise it by various integrity measures within an organisation and within a jurisdiction. And that is the integrity system. A set of normative provisions, of practices, of institutions, called the integrity system, which aim to increase the probability that entrusted power is used for the purposes of which it's given, rather than abused for personal and party political goals. And that is, if you like, why, as I say, good governance is primary. And anti-corruption is actually a necessary part of that, but it cannot be the whole of it. In fact, some governments are elected on anti-corruption background, a platform, and when they're elected on it, no corruption, and actually when I talk about no government, the thing is they don't get their schools, they don't get the roads, the whole thing becomes so hidebound in various rules that actually people end up voting in the corrupt again. I'd prefer to have half a school and the other half goes to support his mistress or his French house than no school at all. And so that's why we must see that it's about ensuring that government does what it ought to, rather than being corrupt. This brings us, I think, to about core of an ethics. Ethics is essentially positive about what you should do rather than what you shouldn't do. Now, you derive from what you should do, what you shouldn't do. But ethics is, I think the fundamental question for ethics for an individual is how should I live my life? And you need to, in order to be ethical, you need to ask hard questions about your values, give honest and public answers, and live by them. And if you do, you have integrity. If you don't, the first person you cheat is yourself, because you're not the person you claim to be and think you are. I actually have written along what I call institutional ethics, which actually ask the same questions about institutions. What are you here for? Basic questions about your values, giving honest and public answers and living by them. And this is, as I say, the basic question of what are we here for? Why is the community better off because we exist? And of course the processes for asking questions, answering them and ensuring they're delivered are more complex, but that is essentially what institutional ethics is about, and that is of course what you need is a combination of ethical standards, legal regulation and institutional reform. We did a lot of work with Transparency International, including trying to fix up their corruption perception index and adding things like the bribery perception index and the global corruption barometer. We also did some work on national integrity systems. You know, what sort of national integrity systems work and what don't. There are actually two studies, one of which we were offered and which we declined, which is the national NIS country studies. We declined not partly because we had a more sophisticated plan going. The other things I was off to Harvard at the time, so I just couldn't do it. But there are the country studies which look at a standard image of a integrity system. Do you have the various pillars, and are they effective? we actually wanted to develop a more sophisticated one, which actually, like the Queensland Governance Reform Commission, looked at what there is and how it's working, but looking not just to whether it's the Western model, but whether it's actually something, some other element. In fact, I always give the example of Poland in 1980. Do a national integrity systems study. Does it have pre-elections? Does it have a judiciary, independent judiciary? Go through the whole lot. Nothing. What you might miss, it had the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church is not always the centre of an integrity system. In fact, often it's been the centre of a corruption system. But in Poland, in 1980, for particular historical reasons, it was the core of government reform. Add solidarity, bolt on a semi-elected parliament, and that's what drove it. And so it's very important that you don't look to what you think you're going to find, but look for what there is. And then the real process then is to look at, having assessed and mapped the integrity system, how could it be improved? It might be improved by strengthening institutions, it might be by adding institutions, it might be by getting the institutions to interact more. But it's a case-by-case, country-by-country study that I think needs to be done and is the only way really to do it. The last thing is that I'll say is that it's not just about integrity systems. One of the interesting things that the NIS studies showed is that there are some countries which seem to have everything that you want in a national integrity system and are as corrupt as anything. And there are some countries that seem to miss key institutional elements and are as clean. And when we launched the National Integrity Systems Assessment, Gerardo Colombo, who's one of the members of the Clean Hands campaign, said he congratulates Charles, it's a wonderful project, it's really important, but I think you should also study national corruption systems. Because in some countries, there is a corruption system, and the corruption system is everything you'd like the integrity system to be. Long-standing relationships, clear norms, effective sanctions, really good incentives, and it just beats the integrity system hand down. In fact, the first thing it tries to do is to corrupt and disrupt the integrity system. And that actually may explain why some countries seem to have good integrity systems but no integrity, and others seem to have weak integrity systems and a lot of integrity. It's because the other independent variable is the extent of the corruption system. And I think this is a really important thing. So going back to Queensland, I talked about the integrity system reform. The most important thing Fitzgerald did was he exposed the way corruption operated in that state so completely the corruption system could never be put back together. There was corruption, individual elements, but the system was destroyed because everybody knew about it. And that was probably the greatest service they did. So the take-home lessons for this is look at what you've got, see how it can be strengthened, take an integrity systems approach, also look at the corruption system, and recognise that the first job of the integrity system is not actually to get the bad apples, but to actually identify, tackle and destroy the corruption system, because that is the quickest way to resolve. And the next thing to say is that recognise that change can be quite quick. All this happened in Queensland in 5 years, and actually much of the important work was done in the first 2. When people who have suffered from a corrupt regime for a long time have long felt change is necessary but change is impossible, if they suddenly find that change is possible, they're an amazing force, and a lot can be achieved quickly, especially if you've got some idea to suggest what they might do. And so the other thing I want to say is aim high. If you aim to be the best and you fail and you're second or third, it's a pretty good way to be. If you aim to be second best, you'll always be second rate. And that, I think, is the real lesson from Queensland, and I believe other states can learn from it. Thank you.